Welcome back, and here we start the first of our 4 biomolecules. We're going to look at the carbohydrate group first. So if you remember in the first unit of biomolecules, we talked about carbon, and the fact that it had 4 valence electrons gives it the ability to make these long backbones, these skeletons for biomolecules. Then in the second unit, we looked at how we link them together. So we looked at the idea of monomers and polymers and how we use dehydration reactions or condensation reactions to link them together and hydrolysis reactions to break them apart. So now let's get specific and actually look at the first one. So the first one we're going to talk about is carbohydrates. It's where we get our energy from. And as the name suggests, carbon and hydrate water, we have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Those are the 3 elements. And if we look at the smallest, most simple ratio, it's CH2O. So we're going to find these 3 elements in a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. So there'll always be twice as much hydrogen as carbon and oxygen. So as I said before, we looked at the monomers and the polymers. So in this case, the monomer, the one part or the unit that we're going to build on is a monosaccharide, so a single one, and in this case it's glucose. So C6H12O6. That's a molecule we're going to come back to a lot this year, so you should be very familiar with it. But if we reduce it, CH2O, it gives us right back to the 1 to 2 to 1 ratio that we talked about earlier. So how are carbohydrates formed? Well, through the process of photosynthesis, we take carbon dioxide, the carbo part, and water, the hydrate part. So carbon plus hydrates equals water and the carbohydrates. And so if we look at the formula, and this is a formula that you're going to have to understand and be able to kind of use from memory, because when we talk about photosynthesis, respiration, and a lot of the processes, energy systems, and biology, we're going to come back to it. So 6 carbon dioxide plus 6 H2O yields 1 molecule of glucose plus 6 molecules of oxygen. So what does that mean? Let's look at, make sure that it balances and that our inputs and outputs are the same. So if we look over here on the left, we've got 6 carbons, which I already had underlined, and yep, we have 6 carbons over on the right. We have 12 hydrogens, and we have 12 hydrogens. Now, how many oxygens do we have? Well, on the left-hand side, 6 times 2, we've got 12 oxygens here, plus another 6 from here. So we've got 18 oxygens total. Well, we have 6 here, plus another 12, so there's our 18 oxygens, so it does cancel. So that's a formula that we're going to see very frequently. So carbohydrates are basically broken down into 3 groups, and we can look at our diet and we get these, all 3 of these groups. The simplest are the monosaccharides, so the 1 units. So glucose, fructose, fruit sugar, galactose, those are all very simple units. There are disaccharides, which are 2 monosaccharides put together to give us maltose, sucrose, which is table sugar, lactose, which is milk sugar, and finally we've got the polysaccharides. A large part of our diet can be made up of this, so we've got starches, like a potato. There's glycogen, which is stored in our muscles and is a form of energy that's readily accessible for us. And then finally there's cellulose, which a lot of the cell walls of plants is made up, and we end up eating a lot of this. We don't digest it very well, but it becomes what we call fiber in our diet, so it's an important part of our diet as well. So, quick review, condensation reactions. How do we make carbohydrates? Well, we link them together, and the specific name given to a condensation or dehydration reaction for carbohydrates is a glycosidic linkage. So the glyco part refers to the sugar part, and so if we look here, here are 2 individual glucose molecules. So there's 6 carbon molecules, and just as we've seen before, we've got our OH, our hydroxyl group, and we've got an H over here, and when they are positioned next to each other, water can be removed, and those 2 will be linked together. So when we have 2 monosaccharides that form a glycosidic linkage, what's the result? Well, 2 monos give us a disaccharide, and that's what we'll look at in the next slide here. So here's the case: glucose plus glucose, water's removed, and we get maltose. So here's a glycosidic linkage. that results in maltose. So maltose or malt sugar, if you've ever had a malted milk ball, Whoppers, it's a different type. It's not quite as sweet. If you've ever had a real malted milkshake, it has a distinct taste to it. In class, I'll give you a chance to try some of these different sugars. And one that we're more familiar with, if we take glucose on the bottom here, glucose, combine it with fructose, we get sucrose, which is table sugar. So we've all had that, and almost daily we have that. So if you've ever heard of high fructose corn syrup, well, that's fructose. That's another sugar for that. So all of these monosaccharides, the simple ones, we can link them together to get bigger and bigger carbohydrates. So glucose, fructose, lactose. Sucrose actually should not be on there because it's not a monosaccharide. So I'm going to draw a line right through that right now. But one thing that I want you to notice from this is they all end in ose. They all end in ose. So we can tell sugars is that they end in ose. And the main function of monosaccharides is energy, short term. If you have some hard candy or something like that, fruit juice, you're going to get energy very quickly. Our body digests it. And the main function, again, is short term energy. So now let's go and look at what some of these monosaccharides look like. So as I said before, when we talked about carbon, they can be linear, they can be chains, they can be branch chains, they can be cyclic. And if we look in the middle here, this shows the chain, and each of them has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbons, okay? But they can fold back on themselves, and we can get the cyclic version, which is shown at the top and the bottom, okay? So the top one is usually what we'll see when we look at these molecules in terms of how they're represented for us, and the cyclic diagram is a pretty good representation. But these are the monosaccharides and just what they look like. So disaccharides now, here's where sucrose should have been, provide energy. And as we've seen before, we looked at sucrose. So when glucose and fructose are combined, we get sucrose. We saw glucose plus glucose gives us maltose. And when we have galactose and glucose, we get milk sugar or lactose. So all of these are held together by dehydration reactions, condensation reactions that link them together in a glycosidic linkage. So there's the disaccharides. And finally, we're going to wrap up with the polysaccharides. So their main function is energy. So sometimes these are called complex carbohydrates because they're long chains of glucose molecules. So they're digested more slowly, so the energy is released over a long period of time, and they really kind of keep us going. The other one is structure. So we talked about how cellulose can be fiber in our diets. Well, cellulose can also make up the cell walls of plants. So there's a structural component in it, and if you looked, there's long chains. So here's starch on the left hand side here. So here's a chain of glucose subunits. So here is a polysaccharide that we can use for energy. Glycogen I had mentioned before. So glycogen is a branched chain, so that's stored in our muscles, and it lets us mobilize glucose into our blood very quickly when we need that extra energy. So we'll talk about the flight and fight response later this year. And then finally, cellulose, we've mentioned before, is another polysaccharide found in plants that we don't digest as well, so it's more of a structural component there. So there's just a real quick outline of the carbohydrates and the information that you'll need to know about what they provide for us and how they're put together. So monosaccharides, disaccharides, and the polysaccharides. So again, thanks for your attention, and we will talk to you soon.